Hello everybody and welcome to Drydock episode 129. This week the questions are taken from Guide 192, that's on the Takao class Japanese heavy cruisers, and on the Battle of Jutland Clash of the Titans Part 3 video. So, with that said, let's get on with question time. UNSC Forward Onto Dawn asks, suppose that at the Washington Naval Treaty the tonnage ratios were 66422 for the US, UK, Japan, France and Italy, rather than the 553 1.75 1.75 ratios in real life. Assuming that the tonnage per ratio point is otherwise the same at 105,000 tons per point for each navy, which additional ships would you keep that were otherwise scrapped? To be perfectly honest, this doesn't really do anyone any favours. If you look at the ships that were allowed to be retained in the original Washington Treaty, Italy and France were already retaining a bunch of pre-dreadnoughts, and their economies weren't in the best shape post-war. I mean, Italy, after the Leonardo da Vinci exploded and sank, they were planning on refitting it and modernising it. It was a Cavour class, but they decided for budgetary reasons that they weren't going to do that. And similarly, Dante Alighieri was scrapped, even though the treaty said they could keep it in the late 1920s, again, because they just couldn't afford to maintain it. So retaining more pre-dreadnoughts doesn't really help, because Italy and France could already keep all their dreadnoughts. And, yeah, as I say, didn't really want to a lot of the time. The Japanese, in theory, could retain some of their older things like the Kawachis and the Satsumas, but again, they don't particularly want to, because they've got the Kongos, Fusos, Isseis, and Nagatos, and as a result, they've got a modern battle line. An additional increase in tonnage just means they keep older ships that aren't of much use to them. The British, as far as they're concerned, again, they're keeping their 15-inch battle line, they're keeping their 15-inch battle cruisers, and an additional 105,000 tons does, which is in World War I capital ship terms around about 4 capital ships worth plus change. That doesn't really let them do much other than keep some of the older 13.5-inch ships. And then when Nelson and Rodney are completed, they'd be scrapping those rather than the ones they were historically scrapping, which again doesn't really do all that much for their battle line. Maybe it allows them to keep Tiger and maybe Princess Royal. And between them and only scrapping the oldest of the 13.5-inch ships, that might create conditions sufficient to allow them to maintain the 13.5-inch battleships and battle cruisers generally, because there's enough commonality, but it doesn't really help all that much apart from a theoretical Tiger refit, and even then that's marginal. The Americans are in the same boat. If you look at the American battle line, they're already historically kind of ignoring Texas and New York to a certain extent, and definitely Arkansas doesn't really feature all that much in the US Navy's battle line planning. So again, if you're allowing them to keep, say, Utah as a fully fledged battleship and 3 or 4 others, it doesn't do all that much for them. It just means they've got the expense of everyone's got the expense of maintaining much older ships. The only real benefit there is that probably a bunch of them get scrapped or turned into training ships or target ships anyway, because it's just not worth keeping them around. But then the various navies have a kind of a bit of headroom, which would possibly mean when they start rebuilding in the 1930s, they might order more ships of these new classes, because they've got this headroom to fill in before they start scrapping older ships, and they'll probably still want to be scrapping older ships anyway. What I think is possibly more likely in this scenario is that with this kind of extra space, which is 3 the 35,000-tonner ships, I3 max displacement treaty era ships, you might therefore see a lot of more argument put forward by everybody to keep the building programs that they've got going running for a little bit. So obviously you're not going to be seeing South Dakota, Lexington, G3, N3, Tosa, Amagi, etc. But what you might see is a kind of a halfway house between Nagato and Tosa being designed, effectively a Japanese version of Nelson and Rodney. You might see Nelson and Rodney have the Nelson class have an extended run, or possibly maybe have a third ship and then maybe 2 battle cruiser variants put in. The Americans will want to keep Washington, the 4th Colorado class, and maybe a couple of follow-on designs, which would again be sort of halfway house between the Colorado and the South Dakotas probably. So I think it's far more likely with that kind of additional tonnage available. The French and the Italians really aren't going to use it at all. But the Japanese, British and Americans are probably going to want to use it more to build further 16-inch ships rather than keep much older vessels. And in fact, they might actually, with that much extra tonnage in place, they might actually push a few bits of the treaty around a bit to allow them to kind of cut off at a more advantageous stage. So for the Japanese, it doesn't matter too much because the minimum caliber they've got in their arsenal is 14-inch, and that's common across everything except for the Nagatos and whatever additional ships they might be building. But for the Americans, where historically they're keeping Arkansas around all the way through into World War II, and the British are keeping some of the Iron Dukes around for a surprisingly long time, along with Tiger, they may very well actually argue that, and possibly even allow the Japanese to get 1 or 2 extra ships in as well, but they may well argue to kind of have a cut-off, so the American battle line is all 14 and 16-inch, the British battle line all 15 and 16-inch, because that makes maintenance easier. The difference between the weakest ship and the strongest ship is a lot closer, and it would allow them to kind of keep their war industries warlike industries a little bit more sustained. Now, obviously, there are massive budgetary issues on most everyone's sides, as we said, especially with France and Italy. But the prospect of spacing out building 3 or 4 follow-on ships, maybe around about in US and UK, and 2 or 3 in Japan, that might, if they're spun out over the 1920s, be something that they look to negotiate, which obviously would change the overall battle line by the time you get to World War II quite considerably. Reva asks, I know it started with rocks on sailing ships, but in the age of steam onward, just what was used for ballast? I get that it needed to stay on board vessels, so it needs to be not routinely consumed, but could it be anything still usable in a pinch, or was it completely dead weight and volume? Ballast has gone through many stages, largely as ships have gotten larger, to be perfectly honest, and also as technology has grown more complex. Even back in the day when they were using rocks and such like, for commercial vessels at least, ballast in and of itself could often be part of a ship's cargo. So rather than just carrying rocks, they would carry something like, say, quarried stone, which is still rock and obviously still very heavy, does perfectly well as ballast. But when you got to the other side of your voyage and you were selling your cargo, you could also sell the quarried rock as building material, and then you could take on something else big and heavy as ballast to take you to your next destination. And this is why you can, in sometimes when you look at certain ports, you can see when the port was really growing, or the growth phases of the port, by looking at the kind of stone that is used in the construction of most of the buildings, because that will tell you, if you can identify where it's from, what ships from which areas of the world were trading the most with that port, and therefore they were obviously taking the ballast stone from them. On warships, of course, when they're not so concerned about trading, it's just about stability, then, yeah, in the Age of Sail, they'd use rocks and such like. But As time went on, ships got bigger, the difference in load between fully loaded and light loaded could change quite dramatically, and as you say, dead weight is not entirely useful aboard a ship, so during various eras the type of ballast would change, but by the time you certainly get to oil-fired ships, with coal it's somewhat more difficult because coal, obviously you've got to move to the boilers, and it's a solid material, doesn't really mix very well with things like water. But once you get to oil-fired vessels, so we're talking mid to late World War One and onwards, as a majority of Navy's vessels, quite often you'll find that the ship's ballast is actually made up of oil fuel. So the ballast tanks lowest down in the ship are also fuel tanks. And then, because obviously oil is lighter than water, as the oil is burnt off, water would be admitted into the ballast tanks to maintain the ballasting effect of the mass all the way down there at the bottom of the ship. Now, this would lead to a certain amount of the oil not really being useful, because you'd get kind of the intermixing of some of the oil and water, and obviously you don't want to feed water into your into the combustion part of your boilers. But that small loss of waste oil was certainly a lot greater it was still of a much greater benefit to ships to have the majority of the ballast tanks capacity available as fuel as well. These days in commercial ships, the ballast tanks are a little bit like the ballast tanks of a submarine. They are filled and emptied of water, obviously not with the intention of sinking the vessel as with a submarine, but yeah, it's generally water exchange in commercial shipping, because the kind of absolute economies that you need to make to get guns and armour and men and fuel in a battleship aren't quite as present in modern ships. And also there's a certain degree of pollution standards, because commercial ships obviously are changing their displacement much more radically, much more often, so they have to ballast and deballast the ship quite regularly. So if you were having oil in there, you'd be pumping out a slurry of oil and water every time you deballasted the ship, which most people are not particularly happy about. So there is quite a difference between the commercial and the military ships and their use of ballast. Stormseer 88 asks, what are the advantages and disadvantages of an internal and external armour belt respectively, and what would you prefer if you were a naval architect? Well, one of the things that is sometimes brought up but is not actually the case is sloped armour belts. It is entirely possible to have a sloped armour belt external to the ship or internal to the ship. You can do different things with a sloped armour belt, depending on if it's internal or external, but the possession of a sloped armour belt is not dependent on whether it's inside or outside of the ship. In terms of an external belt, and to be honest, the advantages of one are the disadvantages of the other, so I won't repeat myself by going over both. I'll just talk about the advantages. The advantages of an external belt are that you're maximising the internal volume of the ship. So if your beam is 108 feet, then if your belt armour is external to that, you have 108 feet minus a fraction internally to use across the ship, whereas obviously not the case internally. An external belt is also much easier to maintain, because obviously it's much easier to get at. You don't have to demolish anything to get to the belt armour. It also means that if your armour resists the impact of an incoming shell, then that's it. The effect on your ship internally is negligible. There might be some shock effects in the immediate area of impact, but there's not going to be flooding, etc., assuming the belt resists the impact properly. Conversely, an internal belt allows you to do all sorts of fancy things with the sloping of your armour without potentially having to compromise something like the stability or hydrodynamic characteristics of your ship, because the exterior hull form can be shaped to whatever it is you want, independent of the protection system. You can also, in theory, hide your main armor belt behind something like, say, a decapping layer, if you want to go for that, like the Italians did, or you can integrate your armor belt into perhaps some of the upper part of the torpedo protection system by building that in front of the armor to a certain degree, as some navies did. It can also, depending on how far internal your belt is, i.e. whether is it just about external and then goes internal on a slope, or whether it's actually internal in so much as you physically can't see any part of the belt armor from the outside. In the latter case, you might also be able to save a little bit of weight, because of course your armor deck comes across to join up with your armor belt, and if your armor belt is some feet inside the ship, then that's additional feet width of deck armor that you don't have to install on your ship, so there's a certain amount of weight saving involved there. As far as the advantages and disadvantages of them, in my perspective, I personally prefer the external armor belt, mainly for the practicality of easy repair, and also for the fact that if your armor belt works as designed and it has rejected the enemy projectile, your ship is otherwise completely intact. My main gripe with internal armor belts is that if you take a hit that is heading towards your main armor protection, regardless of whether or not your main armor protection holds up against it, you are going to have a degree of flooding potentially, and certainly damage to the external structure of your ship, which is still probably likely to result in some sort of flooding or diminishment of the ship's fighting capacity. Galdir Ioni asks, anti-aircraft guns on submarines, were they ever actually effective? Did they ever shoot down or fend off attacking planes, or were they there mostly to make the crew feel better about being strafed? I would say the answer is probably a qualified yes. So, a submarine that tries to duel it out with attacking aircraft using its anti-aircraft gun systems is almost certainly always going to lose. The Germans had a very limited amount of success in World War II with some what are called U-flaks, U-boats equipped with a fairly heavy flak battery, but that was a very temporary thing, mainly because the sheer weight of anti-aircraft fire from a U-boat was not an expected thing, and so initially there was a small degree of success, whilst the RAF, Coastal Command in particular, rejigged their tactics to take account for this, but after a matter of 4 to 8 weeks, everything was kind of back to normal again. Having a relatively decent anti-aircraft gun or two on a submarine was, however, useful to a degree, because without them at all, your enemy could use pretty much any aircraft they liked to conduct anti-submarine patrols, regardless of how slow and vulnerable it was, and they would still score some relatively decent successes because they could line up their attacks lovely, straight, level, slow, almost textbook, and therefore increase their chances of a hit. By having anti-aircraft guns aboard, you couldn't realistically hope to stop most air attacks, but what you could do is, well, you could take advantage of people who are overconfident. You forced your enemy to use somewhat higher capability aircraft, which increases the cost and reduces the number of aircraft they can deploy. And it also means that if an aircraft is having to face conducting its attack runs under fire, it's more likely to release weapons at a longer range and or with less accuracy, which might increase your chances of being able to dive and get away from it in time before it lands a lucky hit. So yeah, anti-aircraft guns on submarines, they're effective in increasing the survivability of submarines, but they're not the kind of thing where you'd want to sit on the surface by choice and duel it out with an incoming aircraft instead of diving. You basically use it as an aid to keep you alive long enough so that you can dive. Bro Dave asks, it's my understanding that at the start of the war the US Navy would have destroyers close to the carriers and cruisers and battleships further away as a fleet defence strategy. However, they changed that later in the war to have most of the firepower closer to the carriers. At what point did they come up with the change, or what incident forced that change? It might be difficult to single it out as beneficial with the US's ever-advancing anti-aircraft technology, but was it an effective change to their strategy, and did the Japanese have a similar fleet set up for defence against air attack? Well, very briefly, with the Japanese, most of their carrier escort formations are composed of cruisers and destroyers. They tend to keep the capital ships separate for surface action. And to be perfectly honest, after the first year or so of the war, the Japanese escorts for anti-aircraft protection are far more limited by operational circumstance and number of ships than they are by any particular governing strategy, because the US turns out to be relatively good at sending Japanese ships to the bottom. As far as the US's fleet strategy is concerned, in part it's to do with the evolving nature of aerial warfare, and in part it's to do with recognised changes in anti-aircraft strategy, but exactly when it transitions over is a little bit hard to pinpoint, especially when you look at whole campaigns like, say, the Guadalcanal campaign, with a number of different carrier air battles that are involved both during and immediately before and after it. You can see a gradual shift in how they organise things, as you may have picked up during the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal videos. Every time one of these battles was fought, the US Navy, and I'm sure the Japanese as well, to some extent, were taking lessons from it and adapting their strategies slightly. So it's not a thing where you can say, right, from this date forth everyone is doing this tactic, and before that they were all doing this tactic. It's more gradual than that. But as far as the reasons for bringing the firepower in closer from the big ships, it basically comes down to the fact that the available anti-aircraft fire at that point, sort of radar-guided 5-inch guns, and certainly by the mid to late part of the war, 40mm Bofors, etc. If you can have such massive concentrations of firepower, relatively speaking, in close, because bear in mind this isn't movie-style in close, they are still a fair distance away, but you can effectively create an anti-aircraft bubble, at least from the heavier anti-aircraft guns, and some overlapping fields of fire for things like the Bofors occasionally, which increase the overall lethality of the air defence shell, whereas in the earlier part of the war, that's not really a thing at all. Manually aiming 5-inch guns for crossfire for anti-aircraft roles is quickly recognised as a bit of a hiding to nothing, and they don't have the massive amounts of 20 and 40mm guns that they would later have, at which point having your larger ships further out, potentially being fire magnets, also able to intercept what everyone's worried about, which is surface attack as well, and able to manoeuvre more independently, are seen as more beneficial. Whereas the faster moving destroyers closer in, they can provide some fire support. By the latter part of the war, obviously, this is no longer the case, and it's just better to form a massive death bubble. And you see this at things like the Battle of Santa Cruz, for example, where the concentration of firepower by moving some of these heavier ships in provides a lot more deadly effect against Japanese flyers than some of the previous battles had, when they'd have to either fly over or potentially around the zones of fire from some of the bigger, more capable anti-aircraft equipped ships. Andrea Marioni asks, if Bayern and Baden had been completed in time to participate in the Battle of Jutland, do you think the outcome would have been the same, or would their 15-inch guns have made a difference? It's highly unlikely they would have made any particular difference, because they're not fast enough to operate with a battle cruiser, so they're going to be with the High Seas Fleet, at which point you've got to consider they could be in one of two positions, or maybe one would be in one and one would be in the other. So either they'd be at the very vanguard of the High Seas Fleet formation, up with things like the Kaisers and the Königs, the most modern ships, or they could be pretty much dead centre of the High Seas Fleet formation if Admiral Scheer, for example, has taken one of them as his flagship, and for commonality reasons keeping the other one close by. They're not going to be in the tail end with the Nassaus and the Helgolands and the the Deutschlands, because, yeah, just no. But if you consider those two potential positions, with the High Seas Fleet's actual involvement in the Battle of Jutland, if they are sort of in the middle of the formation with Admiral Scheer, with one of them being his flagship, then when they run into the Grand Fleet, it's still going to be the Kaisers and the Königs that are going to take the absolute battering that they did, and because of the way the formations are crossing, Scheer is going to recognise the trap and he's going to turn away anyway. So in that case, they're not going to make any difference at all, really. Conversely, if they're leading the formation, then they will have more chance to exercise their guns against the British battleships. But then again, High Seas Fleet basically managed to score effectively nothing in terms of hits on the Grand Fleet. Colossus got hit by a single shell, and it's entirely possible that wasn't even from a High Seas Fleet ship. It may have been from First Scouting Group. In fact, I'm pretty certain it was from Seydlitz. So, assuming that kind of holds true, well, 15-inch shells that kill fish don't really affect the battle all that much. And as the Queen Elizabeth in 5th Battle Squadron had shown, even a big modern 15-inch gunship doesn't really stand up too well to the combined firepower of the entire enemy fleet. So they would, in that position, get badly battered along with the Kaisers and Koenigs, and Scheer still makes the same decision to turn around and pull back. So, yeah, given the way that Jutland went down, having a couple of extra 15-inch gunships is not really going to change much in the way of Admiral Scheer's decision-making process. Econoclast asks, why is it exponentially difficult to increase the number of guns per turret? So I've covered elements of this before, but so I'll briefly highlight those and then talk about some additional factors. So there's the complexity. If you've got a 2-gun turret or a twin turret, you've only got to worry about 2 sets of gun machinery going wrong, and the turret only has to support the weight of 2 guns. If you have a triple turret or a quadruple turret, you have more guns, which means more machinery, more things can go wrong, and the turret itself has to support more weight and rotate more weight, which in turn means it's got to be stronger, it's probably got to be more complex, and all of this adds up to be much harder to pull off as an engineering feat. You've also got to worry about ammunition supply, so your shell, and if you're having separate shell and cartridge or combined shell and cartridge hoist systems to supply a twin turret, is a relatively simple bit of technology. That's fairly well understood by the Dreadnought era, but once you get into triple and quadruple turrets, whilst you might be able to get away with a single hoist system that just works very quickly for a twin turret, although usually you'd want 2, if you get a triple or a quad, you're not getting away with that. You're going to need multiple hoists, which again, much more complex, much more difficult to pull off successfully, much more chance of something breaking down. And of course, that's also going to increase the space that you need in the turret, which is going to increase the weight of the turret, and so on and so forth. The other thing that you have with multiple gun turrets when you get into sort of triples, quads, or quintuples, etc., is their sheer size, not just from the weight perspective, but from the barbette size that you're going to need to support all of this, and that has certain limitations relative to the ship's overall hull form and its beam. A twin turret with its barbette is relatively speaking thin, so you can get a good clearance between the sides of the ship and the barbette all the way down. If you've got a quad turret, that's obviously going to be significantly wider, unless you're doing something like the German extremely wide layout twin 15s, and therefore your ship is overall going to need to be considerably bigger, or else you're going to have some very tight design margins, which again are going to increase the complexity of the design both for the turret and barbette combination and for the ship itself. And then lastly, and this is something that I hadn't fully appreciated, but made a certain amount of engineering sense to me once I'd actually read about it, looking at one of the more recent analyses of the fate of Prince of Wales during the attack on it when it was part of Force Z by the Japanese Navy aircraft. If you have this huge barbette and turret that's supporting, in this case, 4 guns, that's a huge, pretty much solid object in the stern of the ship, or indeed forward of the ship, although in Prince of Wales' case, with this particular analysis, it's the stern because we're talking about the torpedo hits. And when a ship takes a very violent impact, such as, say, from being hit by a torpedo or a particularly nasty shell, that causes the ship's hull to whip and flex. Now, any turret barbette system is going to be a relatively solid piece of kit, so that is going to serve as kind of an anchor point and foreshorten the whipping effect, which of course means that the same energy going into less amount of ship means more shear stress and therefore more chance of actual damage to the ship. But when you're talking a massive socking great quad turret that's occupying a good chunk of the ship's beam and just is physically more voluminous, that's going to act as a huge counter to any kind of movement, and that can exacerbate the level of damage that you might take if the ship is hit fore or aft of those turrets, because effectively, like say with Prince of Wales, if you take a torpedo hit, if you've got a couple of twin turrets, for example, the stern might whip quite considerably, the hull around the twin turrets might whip somewhat, held down a bit by the twin turrets, and then the hull further towards the machinery spaces might whip slightly less. Whereas with a quad, it's kind of like stern whips, whipping motion hits the area where the quad turret is, quad turret just says, no, I'm not moving. And now your stern is moving with a fair bit of energy and the rest of your ship isn't, because pretty much. And that can cause all sorts of started seams, warped bulkheads, etc., which makes flooding worse and causes more complexity with damage control. And triple turrets, kind of similar problem, just slightly less than a quad, but more than a twin, assuming, of course, that we're talking about a relatively linear increase in size, because, as I said, obviously you get things like the German twin 15s, which are actually quite large. If you overlay a Bismarck's twin 15-inch turret top-down view with say a 15-inch 42 twin, you actually see the size difference is huge, and that twin 15 is actually much closer to certain things like triple 16 turrets. And so all of these things and more you have to take into account when you are designing your ship, because there are always going to be trade-offs, and sometimes those trade-offs pay off, sometimes they don't. Sometimes you never get to test them out because the circumstance where that trade-off might arise never comes to pass. Matt Baden asks, what would it take for the High Seas Fleet to have been unquestionably victorious at Jutland? I'm going to say a combination of what I would call a more limited but higher technology approach, and I'll try and explain what I mean by that. Basically, if the High Seas Fleet encounters the Grand Fleet, it is going to have to withdraw under pretty much any reasonably plausible circumstance. Ceding the field to your enemy is not a way to win a battle, and certainly not a way to be seen to win a battle. But if you never encounter that enemy, you obviously can't run away from them. So the first step would be, don't run into the Grand Fleet. How do you accomplish this? Well, I would say the best way of doing it is this sort of more limited but higher tech approach. So if I was Admiral Scheer and I had a certain amount of foreknowledge of what was going to happen, but I wanted to keep it secret for whatever reason, what I would probably do is say to Admiral Mauve, look, I'm really sorry, but we cannot take the Deutschlands. They are too slow. They will hold us back. Very, very sorry about it, but it's just not going to happen. So I've now increased the effective speed of my battle line by a few knots, and I can worry about accelerating much, much less. I can just go, yep, okay, we're going full bore, at least for a little while. Then, when the run to the south starts, and Hipper is beating Beatty 6 ways from Sunday, you immediately go full pelt. Just take all the High Seas Fleet full bore north, damn the engines. And at the same time, and this does rely a little bit on some luck, but yes, a very marginal change in luck, and HMS Lion probably blows up as well. So you've now taken out 3 British battle cruisers. If Lion is completely out of action, that means that Tiger, Princess Royal and New Zealand, the only now surviving battle cruisers, are going to be under a lot heavier fire, and there's also therefore a chance that you might cripple or even possibly destroy one or more of them. Tiger, for example, took a lot of hits overall kind of made it out relatively okay, but Tiger and Princess Royal especially would be more vulnerable to now be basically effectively being double teamed by various German ships for a considerable period of time. Then, because I've been able to move a little bit quicker with the High Seas Fleet, I show up slightly sooner, and so without Beatty, without Lion, and now having something of a leadership crisis, the remaining British battlecruisers, whether that's the 3 or maybe even now 2, are going to face some significant problems. They're going to have to turn back fairly sharpish. Hopefully for them, but hopefully not for the Germans. The bit of sort of confusion because the commander-in-chief of the battlecruiser fleet's gone down with his ship might make them hang around just a little bit too long before turning away, so might be able to inflict more damage, maybe even knock off another ship. And when the Queen Elizabeths show up, there's a little bit of an outside chance of maybe taking out 1 or 2 of them as well. But then, being sheer, I would go, okay, right, we've pretty much effectively annihilated the British battlecruisers, and at this point, Lutzow hasn't taken its fatal damage. There's been a fair battering of them by the Queen Elizabeth, but no one is fatally damaged at this point. And then as sheer, I would go, right, I'm going to call it a day. I'm just going to turn around and head off because I have accomplished one of my major goals. I've eliminated a significant portion of the British battle fleet. The battlecruiser fleet effectively at this point does not exist, even with Australia coming out of dock, until they get Renown and Repulse in service, assuming that they've maybe got 2 battlecruisers left, one of which is almost certainly going to be New Zealand, and whichever one of Tiger and Princess Royal is still alive is probably very badly damaged and going to be out of action for a while. Effectively, the British don't have any real battlecruiser force anymore, at which point I've effectively eliminated their fleet screen opposition to my battlecruisers, who are going to need a bit of time in dockyard for repairs, but they can be back in service a lot quicker than the British can build up their forces, and even once Renown and Repulse come into service, I still outnumber them. Job done. Next time I come out, the British scouting efforts are going to be very much minimised in the face of my superior fleet screen, and I can engineer an engagement against the Grand Fleet to my choosing. Whereas at this particular point in time, I have battered battle cruisers. They're not really going to be able to function too well as a forward fleet screen. And if I do happen to now run into the Grand Fleet, when now I'm a bit strung out, having come in to hammer the battle cruisers, it's going to be a bad day for me. So drop back, repair my battle cruisers, get Bayern and Baden into service, and then go off to the British again on another date. That would have been Jutland as an unquestioned victory for the High Seas Fleet. They would have sunk a significant portion of the British fleet, suffered no capital ship losses in return, and it would go down in history as well. The Grand Fleet just didn't catch up with them, and who knows what could have happened if the Grand Fleet had run into them, but they didn't, so the actual battle itself was a German curb stomp. The wonderfully named Talky Walky Meat Pete asks, if better shells had been used at Jutland, could this have masked the problems with Beatty and his flag officer? Not tremendously, simply because Beatty's battlecruisers didn't score that many hits. I mean, yeah, it would probably make some of the hits they scored somewhat more effective, but even if you sort of teleported the Green Boy shells back to Jutland, it's relatively unlikely that any of those are going to cause any spectacular levels of damage on the point of sort of, you know, like Queen Mary and Indefatigable exploding, and Lion nearly exploding. So it probably would have given even more momentum to the German analysis that big guns really matter, and the British analysis that, well, big guns really help, because obviously, well, more damage would have resulted, so that certainly would have helped the post-battle analysis, but it's not really, it's not going to save the British battle cruisers from exploding. It's not going to save Beatty and Seymour from making a complete mess of the signalling in the first place. In fact, if anything, better shells might expose those problems even more so, because, as I say, Queen Mary and Indefatigable are still going to explode, Lion's still going to be fairly badly damaged, Tiger's still going to take a battering, but then when the Queen Elizabeths come in late, thanks to the poor signalling, when you look at the mauling that they gave the German battle cruisers historically with the dodgy shells, I mean, as I've said in the actual Jutland video, they hit one of the German battle cruisers so hard that the entire stern structure, the entire stern of the ship was waving back and forth to the point that radio aerials strung between the masts were snapping. If those ships are firing Green Boy shells with the much superior penetration, it's entirely possible that they might cripple or destroy, or cripple thus leading to the destruction of, a number of the German battle cruisers. They're certainly going to lay waste to them in an even greater way than they did historically. And that much more dramatic, better outcome from the Queen Elizabeth's performance will stand in such a contrast to Beatty's command, sort of a third of it exploding, that there are going to be even more questions asked, i.e. we sent you out with these ships. When they arrived, they did complete and terrible execution amongst their enemies. Why weren't they there in the first place? If they were there from the start, then all those men on Indefatigable and Queen Mary probably wouldn't have died, because the German ships theoretically would have been under fire, badly damaged, etc. before they could land those hits, which would be a completely valid point. At which point, a lot of questions and eyes are going to be looking at Beatty going, yeah, and why exactly were these doomed ships late to the party? So, yeah, it might actually turn the whole thing around on its head compared to the question. John Rees asks, in a recent live Q&A you commented how much you enjoy watching bureaucracy become a victim of its own mess. Yes, I do. What's your favourite example of a bureaucratic mess-up during World War II? It's a bit more difficult when it comes to something like World War II, because a bureaucratic mess-up in the civilian world, especially during peacetime, is usually just hilarious to watch unfold because of the sheer incompetence involved. But a bureaucratic mess-up in wartime usually results in a lot of people dying unnecessarily, so favourite example is a little bit hard to come by because of the implicit consequences. But if I had to have a favourite bureaucratic mess-up, and one that actually leaves me with a bit of a smile on my face, I think it would probably have to be the one that led to the German decision to use concentration camp slave labour to try and build the V2s, and to a certain extent also I think the V1s, but the V2s especially. Because, and you can see in a bureaucrat's mind exactly what the logical solution was. They were thinking, well, we need all the fighting Übermensch out on the front lines, and so we need more people to build these weapons in the factories behind the lines, and we don't have those people, but we do have this large number of people in concentration camps, and we can use them as slave labour, and so we can drive them harder. We don't have to pay them, we don't have to pay them at all, we just have to feed them, and we don't have to feed them that much, so the overall cost of production is quite a bit lower, and we'll have greater output of weaponry, and we don't have to reduce the strength of our frontline fighting units, so it's all a win-win-win for us. Great, okay, let's put all the concentration camp inmates on weapons production. And yeah, as I say, in a bureaucratic mindset, it's but humans in, humans out, all makes perfect sense. Of course, they didn't stop to think about the fact that, you know, people that you've horribly and brutally tortured, starved, beaten, etc., 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 in concentration camps for who knows how long, and are probably at this point aware of what's happened to an awful lot of their friends and family, may not be the world's most willing and conscientious workers when you ask them to produce sort of large-scale strategic weapons. And yeah, shockingly enough, they weren't, and no matter what the Germans did, they were fairly successful in introducing all sorts of little bits of, shall we say, manufacturing errors and flaws, effectively sabotage, into the production, which really complicated the V2's production process and rendered quite a lot of them either non-operational or hilariously inaccurate. Obviously, it wasn't enough to stop all the V2s being launched that were launched from hitting their targets, but it did cause the Germans no end of problems, and it saved probably a fair number of lives at the receiving end. Of course, unfortunately, the Germans did retaliate against the inmates once they realised what was going on, which, again, still lives lost. It's not a pleasant thing, but overall, the comeuppance that the Germans got for imagining that, just in the bureaucratic mindset, that a bunch of people that they'd horribly brutalised in concentration camps would be willing to build them weapons and not wreck them, that probably counts as a fairly high-rated bureaucratic mess-up in my favourites list. Bill Brockman asks, how important was the sinking of the Blucher by Norwegian defences in the overall course of the war? On a strategic scale, it's not terribly important, to be perfectly honest. I mean, on a strategic scale, Germany's still going to lose the war. The Kriegsmarine is still going to end up either sunk at sea or bombed in port. But on a more tactical level, on a sort of a slightly more narrowly focused scale, it is actually quite important, because the Kriegsmarine really, by the mid and certainly definitely by the late part of the war, is pretty much confined in its operations and only poses a very niche threat. Whereas in the earlier part of the war, they are able to operate with a fair bit more freedom and pose a considerably larger threat to Allied activities. And in that respect, the sinking of the Blucher is actually fairly important to specifically the Royal Navy Kriegsmarine aspect of the conflict. And the reason for that is that with the loss of Blucher, the Germans don't have any heavy cruisers. Because, well, they've got the Panzerschiff, if you count them as heavy cruisers, which I suppose technically they are, but Lützow, ex-Deutschland, badly damaged. Admiral Graf Spee is obviously already sunk at this point. Hipper has been damaged in her encounter with Glowworm. Prinz Eugen is not yet completed and will then obviously go out with Bismarck, get stuck in Brest for ages, and eventually make it back during Operation Cerberus. So Prince Eugen's impact on pretty much the entire early and mid part of World War II is effectively nothing. Really, the only other effective unit the Germans have in terms of heavy units that are able to do surface raiding outside of the battleships and the two Scharnhorst is Admiral Scheer, and even then it gets in kind of one decent raiding mission in 1940, mainly because it's undergoing refit during the early part of 1940. Hipper gets also a raiding mission off later on once it's been repaired. But these are kind of solo-ish type operations and don't have a dramatically large effect. Whereas if Blucher survives the Norwegian campaign, then, well, that's a 50% increase in available surface raiders that aren't battleships, which has a considerably greater, obviously, then impact on Allied operations at sea, and more particularly if Blucher survives the operations in Norway and is sent out to sea with Admiral Hipper once she's finished her repairs in the latter part of 1940. There's the engagement that Hipper has with a troopship convoy right up towards the end of the year. Now, that's the battle where she ends up having a shooting match with HMS Berwick and winning, arguably, that battle, even though she has to withdraw because there are other cruisers and carriers escorting the convoy. Obviously, a troopship convoy is quite important. If Blucher was with Hipper, then arguably they could have sunk rather than just damaged some of the troop ships before Berwick and the destroyers showed up. And two Hipper-class cruisers against Berwick, they might well have been much more tempted to stand their ground and actually shoot it out with Berwick, potentially sinking it, and forcing the other cruisers to come and destroyers to come forward. And considering the only other escorts in terms of cruisers were a D-class cruiser and a Dido class, much as I like the Dido class, one Dido and an old D class are not going to be a match for two Hippers, which means that you'd have to then look at the carrier escort to try and drive off the ships, which it could very well snowball and get very, very bad, and it could have a huge impact then if that troop ship convoy is badly damaged or potentially, well, not destroyed because there's too many of them, they can scatter, but very badly mauled. And it's really in this mid to late 1940, early 1941 period that the German heavy ships, the cruisers and capital ships, have the kind of the heyday of breaking out into the Atlantic and causing havoc. If Blucher had been around for all of that, then she could have made 2, possibly 3 missions, especially if that one with Hipper goes as well as it potentially could have done. And so its overall impact on Allied shipping, Allied measures, etc., could have been quite considerable. Chances are, by mid-43 onwards, she's going to end up either in the Baltic or Norway and stay there for the rest of the war, potentially influencing the outcome of the Battle of Barents Sea, but possibly not, because if she's around, the British might increase the number of escorts and so on and so forth. But yeah, certainly she could have had a significant impact on the Kriegsmarine's course of operations if she'd survived. Matt Kidd asks, 20th century warships seem somewhat unique in the degree to which individual sailors are disconnected from the battle and unable to take any individual action which would increase their chances of survival. Did World War I and World War II navies do any training to help crewmen deal with this sort of helpless stress? Not specifically that I'm aware of, but there is a certain degree of disconnectedness that helps to mitigate the stress somewhat. For example, I'm aware of an interview that was done with a chap who was aboard HMS Belfast during the Battle of the North Cape, and people were asking what it was like, but his position was in one of the forward damage control stations well below deck, so his recollection of the entire Battle of the North Cape, which of course to us is this sort of snowstorms and sinking the Scharnhorst, pursuing it, torpedoes and gunfire everywhere, but to him, who could see nothing and had no real clue what was going on other than that they were engaging the enemy, he was just sort of standing there at his damage control station going, well, if something happens, I know what my job is, and as far as anything else was concerned, the only difference between day-to-day activity and now was, well, he was at his action station instead of it just going around his normal business, and occasionally he could hear the thump of the 6-inch guns firing. That was pretty much it. I mean, you might know that you're in a battle, but unless you have a very, very, very active imagination, the amount of stress that is going to cause is probably not a tremendous amount. But also, you've got to consider the fact that a warship is not like a cruise ship. There's not, in the middle of a battle, most people will have something to do. They're either going to be so remote disconnected if they're in something like, say, the medical stations or damage control stations away from the main ship systems, that as far as they're concerned, apart from where they are, not a lot else has changed. Whereas the people who are a little bit more involved with things like gunners, people on the bridge, engineering staff, etc., they're going to be so dug into their work, loading and firing the guns, keeping the engines running, etc. And bearing in mind, pretty much everyone in the turret is not going to be able to see out of it. So even though they're the ones firing at the enemy, and they know that there's an enemy to fire at, most of them aren't going to be seeing what's going on. And down in the engine room, obviously not going to be seeing what's going on. But you're going to be very, very enraptured with, I need to do this job. I don't want to let my friends down. I don't want to let my ship down. We want to win whatever engagement it is we happen to be fighting out there. So you're not going to have the time in those circumstances to focus on the stress of what might happen. And to be perfectly honest, if something does happen, chances are it's probably going to be over very quickly. So it's not really going to be a massive problem even then. At least I think that's how I've interpreted reading and looking at interviews and listening to interviews of people who have served in action on World War II ships. If there are people who know of people who served in action on World War II ships, or maybe even one or two who actually have, who are watching the channel, I would like to chime in with a different opinion or something like that, then sure, please do so in the comments. Richard Newton asks, I'm curious as to how many shipbuilding companies in the UK survived the Depression as opposed to existed during World War One. Do you have any idea about how many docks, slipways, etc. were available as the Royal Navy started its rearmament building plans? The actual number of available docks and slipways available in the interwar rearmament period in the mid-1930s was actually not dramatically reduced compared to during World War One, surprisingly enough. In part, that's because, well, the Royal Navy was still, with now along with the US Navy, the joint largest navy in the world, so there was still a reasonable amount of work going around for some new ships being constructed, as well as existing ships going under repair and refit throughout the interwar period. There were some mergers. For example, Vickers and Armstrong in World War One were two separate companies. They then became Vickers Armstrong in the interwar period, but the two great yards that they had were retained. And you had Britain was still a big shipbuilding nation at the point. So you had trying to make good the various merchant ship losses from World War One. You had other nations ordering ships from them, and ships coming in for repair, both from commercial and civilian interests, both British and international. So whilst the operational pace of some of the shipyards slowed down, there weren't many of the big shipyards that had significant problems. Some of the much smaller ones went under or changed ownership, etc. But when it came to actually building full-scale warships, the Royal Navy had almost as near as much, to make no difference, almost as much resource to call on slipway-wise as they did in World War One. The main problem they had was that everything had gotten bigger. Battleships were now 35,000 tonners. You had carriers, whereas before, if you were just building battleships in World War One, now when you're building big carriers, those are going to occupy slipways that otherwise in World War One might have been taken up by battleships or battle cruisers. Heavy cruisers especially, obviously, have gotten a lot larger as well, although they're not building heavy cruisers during the interwar build-up period. You've got things like the Town class, which again are taking up quite a bit of space, because a 10,000-ton Town class cruiser takes up an awful lot more space than a C class or a World War One era Town class cruiser. So there's more competition for the bigger slipways, and then you've got all the smaller civilian slipways which could be used for building escorts and stuff. What had really suffered in the interim that affected shipbuilding was not so much the actual physical dockyard infrastructure, it was more the niche warship specific industry, stuff like gun foundries, shell manufactories, armour makers especially. Those, because obviously those don't have transferable skills to go over to building things for the civilian market, unlike shipyards, which can build liners or cargo ships or warships for the most part. Obviously, certain civilian yards can only build merchant ships, but then they don't matter for warship production too much. But it was more the specialist naval industries that really suffered from the massive downturn in the order for new naval equipment of that kind of nature, to the point that by the time you got to the rearmament period, shortages of things like armour plate meant that the Royal Navy was having to buy Czech-made armour plate for some of the carriers, for example, so that the remaining armour manufacturers could concentrate on building things like the armour plate for King George V class battleships and such. Francis Beckerleg asks, how expensive would the refits of Hood that you talked about in the Hood refit video be? Did the Royal Navy and British government in general even have the ability to refit all their ships during wartime, considering other military service expenses? So to give some idea, the cost of the refit and modernisation of HMS Renown was just over £3 million. The cost of a brand new King George V class battleship was just under £7.5 million, and Vanguard ended up costing just over, or at pretty much dead on, £11.5 million. So, I mean, Hood's a bit bigger than Renown, and it's got obviously an extra turret, but at the same time, under the theoretical refit that we were looking at, it's also stealing a bunch of materials from that had been pre-prepared for Vanguard. So, I mean, technically that cost is still there, but the overall cost is probably maybe fractionally less because you're not having to order things fresh. So I would estimate that Hood's refit, as discussed theoretically, if you include the baseline cost of the stuff it's stealing from Vanguard, is probably going to be somewhere in the order of £4 million, which, when you compare it to the cost of brand new warships, you can see why it's actually economically relatively efficient. Of course, repairing the damage might add to that, but it's not going to go. I think it's probably 4 million plus or minus £500,000 as a broad estimate. As far as having the ability to refit all their ships in wartime, considering other military expenses, well, obviously, even during wartime, you're not going to be spending all the money that is physically possible to spend, although obviously budgets are somewhat more generous in wartime. Theoretically, yes, there are shipyards available, but resources are stretched quite thin. One of the many reasons for the delays on Vanguard, for example, was that the carrier Implacable was being built nearby, and they just didn't have enough skilled men to build both of them at full tilt at the same time. So they ended up prioritising Implacable first and then moving the men over to Vanguard. So yes, if the government wanted, and the Admiralty wanted Hood refitted and back in action ASAP, they could do it, regardless of particularly any given expense. But as I mentioned in the video, there is also the possibility that they might send it over to the USA for refit. It's still going to cost money, but the stress on British yards, which are kind of on the front line, might be somewhat less. Leops 1984 asks, Gilbert and Sullivan wrote about the modern major general, i.e. generals who know more about non-military matters than actual warfighting. Did the Royal Navy ever have a similar problem? To a certain extent, yes, but not quite as badly as perhaps the Army did on occasion. Especially during prolonged periods of peace, such as, say, the latter part of the 19th century, the Royal Navy could get to a point where officers would become a little bit too acquainted with matters of spit and polish and paint, rather than, the actual practical aspects of shooting the enemy and sinking them. But the Navy, for obvious reasons, when you consider the fact that Britain is an island, ended up in a lot more active engagements, generally speaking, on a more regular basis than the Army did. The Army could go through, certainly at that point, relatively long periods of peace where not a lot was happening. Obviously, out in the various colonies of the Empire, things could be a little bit more active, but large portions of the Army might not see action for years, even decades, at which point you're basically down to parade ground and the occasional drill. Whereas for the Royal Navy, although this kind of spit and polish and follow the letter of the law mentality could creep in, ultimately a ship at sea is still something you need to keep your mind focused on, because, if you don't, it's going to go aground or capsize or blow up, or something equally horrible is going to happen to you. So it tends to focus the mind just a little bit more. Ships in the Royal Navy, pretty much from the start of its first big conflicts with France in the Age of Sail through to the end of World War II, didn't spend an awful lot of time swinging around at the anchor. They either were fighting to gain an empire, protect an empire, guard an empire, enforce rules on an empire, or later on show off the empire to everybody else. So they were significantly more active, shall we say. But there were occasionally officers who you look at and go, well, yes, you are perhaps very, very good at diplomacy and politics and very good at keeping your ships looking very nice and keeping everyone very happy, but I wouldn't necessarily trust you to lead anyone into combat. But fortunately, those were fairly rare exceptions. Bunkering Down asks, how would a pre-Dreadnought or Dreadnought Battleship fare against a modern anti-ship missile? It depends entirely on how you define modern anti-shipping missile, to be perfectly honest. I mean, as I've said before, it's not exactly my kind of area of speciality, but when you look at, let's say, anti-shipping missiles from the past 30 years, you could be talking about anything from a subsonic missile that weighs less than the average battleship shell and may just quite happily plough straight into the side of a ship, through to something that might weigh as much as a small torpedo boat and has a warhead that's as heavy as an entire battleship shell in and of itself, plus might have armor-piercing capabilities, diving pop-up capabilities, and might be arriving at supersonic or hypersonic speeds. The former missile might happily plink off the belt armour even of a pre-Dreadnought, and certainly a Dreadnought you're just going to smear itself across the side. If it hits the belt armour, the latter doesn't really matter where it hits, it's just going to punch straight in and cause a tremendous amount of damage. And everything in between, depending on size, shape, type of warhead, weight of warhead, speed, and sort of where it's hitting as well. So it's pretty much an open question, defined entirely by what exactly you're throwing at it. So, channel admin, the last part of the Drydock. Well, the good news is that a very kind individual, probably following the one of the questions on one of last month's live streams, has in fact sent me the Kobe Blocks HMS Warspite. So at some point I will be doing a live stream where we are building Warspite and answering questions. I suspect that I probably will pre-record the build, because I suspect it's probably going to take a reasonable amount of time, and then accelerate the footage to a reasonable time length, and then have that in the background whilst I'm answering questions, because otherwise it'll probably just drag out forever and a day with me trying to focus on how to build the blasted thing whilst also trying to think about answers to questions and looking up at the questions, etc., which is probably, based on my experience of trying to answer questions while playing World of Warships, not necessarily the best idea. So it will be a live stream with a semi-live footage of the construction. But that's my idea at the moment anyway. So that's really, I think, the only bit of channel admin for this week, other than to say, well, thank you very much for watching, and hope to see you again in another video. And I'll leave you with, considering that we've had so many questions on HMS Pinafore, well, it's your fault. You keep asking these questions, so I am the very model of a modern Major General. I've information, vegetable, animal, and mineral. I know the kings of England, and I quote the fights historical, from Marathon to Waterloo in order categorical. I'm very well acquainted too with matters mathematical. I understand equations, both simple and quadratical. About binomial theorem, I'm teeming with a lot of news, with many cheerful facts about the square of the hypotenuse. I'm very good at integral and differential calculus. I know the scientific names of beings animalculous. In short, in matters vegetable, animal, and mineral, I am the very model of a modern Major General. There you go. Now you can see why I don't sing.